Okay, so here's the thing, and this is really, really unusual for me to record two videos in like one night. It's unusual for me to record two videos in 1 week, let's be honest. But this was just something that occurred to me actually as I laid in the bath, thinking through some of the things I'd said in my earlier video, and it was a kind of. I'm not going to claim that it is an original thought because, of course, it isn't. I don't think an original thought has ever passed through my head. How could it? With 7 or 8 billion human beings living on this planet after tens of thousands of years of human existence. But it's original to me, and it involved the way that we parcel off the way we think about things and the way we accept things versus the quite reasonable acceptance we have with regard to the claims that other people make. And moreover, the fact that this difference between the two things, which is in my mind quite reasonable, we don't accept as reasonable, and perhaps we ought to, and maybe we ought to think on it a little bit more. And I'll tell you what prompted that. So I'd made a response to the guy, the worst person on the internet, whose real name I still can't remember, real internet name, and somebody called him red-headed fuckface or something in the comments, and I'm quite sure that wasn't it. But I was considering how I feel about him and how I feel about the distributist, which is the person that he was responding to in the video that I was responding to. And they're both individuals that I have some time for. They both, in my view, although they're totally different in terms of their positions, represent the better aspect of this part of YouTube, as opposed to some of the other parts of YouTube, which are about not just about different subjects, but are facing in different ways. They're about just informing you about something, or talking about video games, or how to plaster your wall in the best way, or whatever. A different sort of way of looking at things. In the opinions sort of side of YouTube, they both represent people that are of sufficient intelligence, which sounds quite like I'm sort of saying, "Oh, you're just good enough." I don't mean that. I hope that I'm of sufficient intelligence to be worth listening to, and I think they are along the same ilk. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be super intelligent, but you have to be sufficient sort of intelligence and thinking to be worth listening to, and they are definitely both amongst that crowd. Notwithstanding that, they are very, very different opinions, and this is kind of where it got me started, because starting from that viewpoint, what I was talking to myself in the bath, as I often do, I made the point to myself in the bath that I would make if I was making it more generally, which is, whilst I think that they're both people that are worth listening to, and that they both have some ideas of which I share and find myself agreeing with, nevertheless, there is a lot more issues, I would say, where I would side with the worst person on the internet, notwithstanding his present name, than I would with the distributist. So that was my starting point for this little journey. And so the journey then would be the challenge to that. And the challenge to that is, okay, let's have some examples. Put a little bit of flesh on the bones, give us some examples. What is it with regard to the distributist that you don't agree with, or with the other guy that you don't agree with, or you do agree with? Give us some balance to that. And it made me think about the way that we process these things and sort of store these things away. And I don't have that information. I don't think we store that kind of information. I think we store it as a kind of average and number of samples and chuck away the rest of the data. I'll sort of say we store a person as sort of a score and an amount of experience we have, and we don't store everything else. It's almost as if you asked me about a restaurant or a pub that I ate at 5 or 10 years ago and say, what was it like? And I'll tell you it's great or it's crap. But if you asked me why it was great or why it was crap or what meal I had and what was up with that meal or what was great about that meal, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. That isn't the thing that we store. And even further than that, you might be able to say to me, well, do you trust your mother? And I'd say, yeah, absolutely, I trust my mother with my life. But if you asked me, said, well, say, put some flesh on the bones, Jim, why do you trust your mother? Give some examples of why you trust your mother. I mean, there must be myriad examples, hundreds, maybe thousands of things that I could give over the 47 years. Potentially, if I was to rewind that tape, that would justify that. But I probably would struggle to give you two or three. Quite frankly, I'd struggle to give you two or three that weren't just generalizations, because I think as human beings we don't store that kind of information. We sort of store a general feeling. We satisfy ourselves that the information we have fits to something, and then as more and more comes in, mother does this, mother does this, mother does this, does it sit with what we already have, right? Or does it go against it? If it goes against it, then we reevaluate it. But if it doesn't, it just solidifies what we have. But we don't remember the details. And then you end up with a situation, of course, where people will ask you that, and you cannot give that kind of information. And you end up with a rather unedifying situation where, to yourself, possibly quite reasonably, you feel justified in what you think. But from the other person's perspective, you have no justification in what you think. And it gave me pause for thought. I think from the perspective of an outside person, it is unedifying to just take somebody's word for it on that. You do need the flesh on the bones. But I think it's wrong to fire it back at somebody and say, well, you have no reason, no justification for holding that belief on the basis that you cannot put the flesh on the bones. Because I think that disregards the way that we hold that kind of information, if you see what I mean. That's it. That was the revelation, I suppose. I don't know how much of a revelation that will be to some people, but it kind of was to me, because I suppose I've always, would I in that situation have sort of cut some slack? I try and cut some slack to people, so maybe I would have done, but I always assume that if you can justify something, you should be able to justify it, and yet actually I think there's a fair case to be made that you can justify something to yourself on the basis of information, notwithstanding the details being lost, whereby to justify it to somebody else, the details being lost is sufficient for it no longer to provide that kind of justification. Does that make sense? Is that worth the video? I don't know. Probably not. That's why it's on my second channel. But if you've listened to it, well, I hope you found it of some value. It's certainly something that I thought about and thought, you know what, I think it's worth reiterating.